Snow comes sideways off the lake at this hour, and the woman kneeling in the ditch has already stopped feeling her hands. She is 81 years old. Her coat is gone. She gave it away 3 weeks back on a night just like this one, and now she is folded against a fence post on the county road with the wind stripping the warmth out of her one breath at a time. Headlights find her. A truck slows. A door opens and a German shepherd hits the snow before the man does. The dog reached her first. He always did. He pressed his whole body against the side of the woman, flank to shoulder, and held there while the man came down the embankment with his boots breaking through the crust. The man dropped to one knee. He had seen people go quiet like this before in places far from here, and the quiet always frightened him more than screaming ever had. He put 2 fingers to the side of her throat and felt the pulse slow and far away like a clock heard through a wall. If a story about loyalty and the people we almost lose is one you want to sit with, stay through to the end and consider subscribing so the next one finds you. Now back to the road, and the woman and the dog who would not move. His name was Daniel Cormack, and he had not planned to be on that road at all. He was 39, broad through the shoulders, with a short crop of dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that had spent too many years squinting into weather. There was a thin scar along the left side of his jaw, pale against skin the color of worked leather, and his eyes had the habit of moving even when the rest of him was still. Reading, the road, the tree line, the gap between things. He had been a Marine, a gunnery sergeant with 2 tours behind him, and a third he did not talk about. And he had come north to this stretch of frozen farm country to settle his late uncle's small house and then leave. He had told himself he would be gone by spring. He told himself a lot of things. The dog was called Birch. He was a working-line German shepherd, 4 years old, 80 pounds of muscle under a tannin black saddle coat, with tall ears that never seemed to rest, and dark eyes that took a measure of every person who came near. Daniel had not bought him. Birch had come to him at the tail end of his service, a washout from a kennel program, too willful for the handlers and too smart to quit. The two of them had recognized something in each other that neither could name. Birch rarely acted without a reason, and Daniel had learned to trust that more than words. Now Birch would not leave the woman. Daniel got an arm under her shoulders and the other under her knees and lifted, and she weighed almost nothing, like a bundle of kindling wrapped in a thin dress. He carried her up the embankment with the snow blinding him and laid her across the bench seat of the truck, and Birch leapt up after her and lay over her legs without being told. Daniel cranked the heat to its limit and turned the truck toward the lights of the town 9 miles off, and he drove faster than the road wanted him to. The town was called Shivering, set on the western shore of a long gray lake that froze solid by Christmas most years. It had a feed store, a diner, a single pump gas station, and a clinic that kept a doctor 3 days a week, and a nurse the rest. The nurse on duty that night was a woman in her 50s named Ruth Ardley, square-built and unhurried, who took one look at the bundle in Daniel's arms and pointed him to the back room without a wasted word. She knew the woman. Everyone in Halvern knew the woman. Her name was Eleanor Pace, and she had taught the 3rd grade in that town for 31 years, and there was hardly a grown adult within 40 miles who had not once sat at her feet on a braided rug while she read aloud. They warmed her slowly. Ruth knew the way of it, that you do not rush a body back from the cold, that the heart can stop from the shock of warmth coming too fast. They packed her with blankets, warmed on a radiator, and slid a heated pad along her spine, and waited, and Daniel stood in the doorway with melting snow dripping off his shoulders. not knowing why he could not bring himself to leave. Birch sat at the foot of the cot with his ears forward, watching the old woman's face as if he meant to call her back himself. She came around near midnight. Her eyes opened, pale blue and clouded at the edges, and they found the dog before they found anything else. Her cracked lips moved. Daniel leaned in to hear. "There you are," she whispered to Birch. "I wondered if you would come back for me." Daniel did not understand it then. He thought she was confused, the cold still tangled in her mind. But Birch rose and put his chin on the edge of the cot, and Eleanor lifted one shaking hand and laid it on the broad flat of his head, and the dog closed his eyes. It was not the behavior of a strange dog meeting a strange woman. Daniel filed it away the way he filed everything, quietly, for later. Ruth pulled him into the hall. "She walks that road every few days," she said softly. "Out to the old chapel and back, 3 miles each way. We have all told her to stop. She does not listen." She paused. "But she had a coat, a good wool one, brown. She has worn it 20 years. Where is her coat?" Daniel had no answer. He drove home through the thinning snow with Birch riding shotgun, and the question stayed in his head longer than he expected. Where was her coat? A woman of 81 does not walk 3 miles into a storm without a coat, unless something has gone wrong, and the wrongness of it sat in his chest like a stone. He had not meant to go back to the clinic. He told himself he was only checking that she had survived the night. But morning found him there with 2 coffees and a paper bag of biscuits from the diner, and Eleanor was sitting up against the pillows, looking smaller than she had in the dark and twice as alive. She studied him with those pale eyes and seemed to decide something. "You are the Cormack boy," she said. "Howard's nephew, he spoke of you." Her voice was thin, but it carried the cadence of a woman who had commanded a room of children for 3 decades. "He left you the house on Sumac Lane." "He did," Daniel said. He set the coffee on the table beside her. "You knew him." "I knew everyone." She said it without pride, simply a fact of a long life in a small place. "Sit down. You are blocking the light." He sat. Birch settled against his boot. And Eleanor looked at the dog for a long moment, and her eyes went somewhere far off, and she began in her own time to tell him about the coat. It had happened 3 weeks earlier, she said, on the worst night of the early winter. She had been walking back from the chapel later than she should have, and the storm had come down hard and fast, the way they do off the lake, and she had nearly turned for home when she heard it. A sound under the wind, a whimper. She had followed it to the culvert, where the road crossed the creek, and there, wedged into the concrete mouth of the pipe, out of the worst of the wind, was a dog. Half-grown, ribs showing, soaked to the skin, and shaking so hard its teeth clicked. Someone had dumped it, she figured. People did that out past the town line, drove their unwanted animals to the edge of nowhere, and let them out, and drove away. "I could not carry it," she said. "My arms are no good any more, and it would not come to me. It was too afraid. So I took off my coat, and I wrapped it around the poor thing as best I could, and I sat with it in the culvert until the worst of the storm passed, and then I walked home." She smiled faintly. "I was cold, but I have been cold before." Daniel looked at her. "You gave a stray dog your coat and walked 3 miles home in a blizzard." It was shivering, she said, as though that settled the matter entirely. And in her world, Daniel understood. It did. "What happened to the dog?" Her smile faded. "It was gone in the morning. I went back with food. The coat was there in the culvert, but the dog was gone. I have gone back every few days since. She looked down at her hands. I suppose I wanted to know it. Lived. That is why I was out there last night. I keep thinking I will find it, and it will be all right, and I will know the coat did some good. Birch lifted his head. He looked at the old woman, and then he looked at the door, and a low sound moved in his chest that was not quite a growl. Daniel had learned to read that sound. It was not threat. It was attention. The dog had caught something the people in the room had not. He would understand it later. For now he only knew that an 81-year-old woman had given away her only protection against the cold to save an animal she would never see again, and that she had nearly died walking back out to look for it, and that something about the whole thing did not add up the way a simple act of kindness should, because Ruth had said it plainly in the hall. People had told Eleanor to stop walking that road, and someone, Daniel was beginning to suspect, had a reason to want her out on it. He found out why over the following week, and the finding came in pieces. The first piece was the chapel itself. He drove out to see it, Birch beside him, on a gray afternoon when the snow had hardened to a crust that squeaked underfoot. It stood at the end of the county road, where the pavement gave out a small white clapboard building with a steep roof and a single bell in a wooden tower, the kind of country chapel that had served a farming community a century back and had mostly emptied since. There was a graveyard beside it, the stones leaning at angles, and a fenced acre behind that had gone to brush. It was a forgotten place, but it was not abandoned. Someone had been there. There were tire tracks in the snow, wide ones, the kind a heavy truck leaves, and they did not belong to any churchgoer. The second piece was the sign. Nailed to the chapel door, fresh, the paper still crisp, was a notice. Daniel read it twice. The land the chapel stood on, and the 11 acres around it, including the old graveyard, had been listed for sale by a company called Meridian Land Holdings, with a closing date set for the 1st of March. The notice cited a tax lien. It said the parish that had once held the deed was defunct, the property reverted, the sale lawful and final. Daniel stood in the cold and looked at the leaning gravestones in the small white building, and he felt the old familiar tightening in his chest, the one that came when he saw something taken from people who could not stop the taking. The third piece was Eleanor. He went back to the clinic, where Ruth had insisted she stay another 2 days, and he told her what he had seen, and the old woman's face went still in a way he had not seen before. "My husband is buried there," she said quietly, "and my daughter." She let that sit. Frank built half that chapel with his own hands. The bell tower, the back steps. We were married in it. I have walked out there to sit with them every week for 19 years. Her hands had begun to tremble, and not from cold. "They cannot sell the ground my family is buried in. They cannot." They could, it seemed, and worse, Daniel learned. They had been counting on no one noticing until it was done. Because the only person who walked that road, the only person who would have seen the notice and the tracks and the surveyor's stakes that had begun to appear in the frozen brush, was a woman of 81 whom the whole town had been gently begging to stay home. And that woman had nearly frozen to death out there 3 weeks after she gave her coat away. On the very road that led to the land, someone wanted emptied and quiet. Daniel was not a man who believed in coincidence. He had survived too long. By not believing in it, he started asking questions, the slow, careful way he did everything. The diner was the center of Halvern, and the woman who ran it was named Cass Brennan, 56, broad-handed and quick-eyed, who had fed the town through 3 recessions and knew where every dollar in it had come from and gone. She poured Daniel coffee he had not asked for and sat down across from him with the directness of a woman who did not have time to circle a thing. "Meridian," she said when he asked. They had been buying up the dead corners of 3 counties, old church land, foreclosed farms, anything with a lien they can lean on. They send a man around, smooth fellow, calls it heritage preservation. She snorted. What they preserve is the mineral rights. There is sand under this whole shelf, the kind they truck off to the gas fields down south. They strip it, they sell it, they leave a pit. They did it to the Okafor place last spring. Drained the pond doing it. Who is the man they send? Calls himself Pruitt. Garrett Pruitt. Cass's mouth went flat. Wears a long gray coat too clean for these roads. Smiles like he is doing you a favor, while he takes the floor out from under you. She got up, refilled a pot of the warmer, and came back. She did not sit this time. She leaned on the counter and lowered her voice, though the diner was empty, but for the 2 of them and a trucker asleep over coffee in the corner booth. I will tell you what I told the Okafors for all the good it did. That lien they wave around is a paper trick. They find a property where the owners are dead or scattered or too old to fight. They dig up some lapsed tax from 20 years back, and they call the land theirs before anybody thinks to check the dates. By the time the family understands what happened, the equipment is already on the ground. She tapped one broad finger on the counter. Check the dates. That is the whole of it. Whatever paper they showed you, the lie is in the dates. Daniel turned that over. You sound like you have checked them. I tried. Cass's jaw tightened. I am a cook, not a lawyer. I did not know where to look. The Okafors did not either, and they lost their pond and their back 40 for it. She studied him. Then, the way Eleanor had, taking a measure. You look like a man who knows where to look, Birch. Lying under the table, lifted his head at the name. Daniel noticed. He was noticing everything now. He met Pruitt 4 days later, and the meeting confirmed every instinct the dog had shown. Pruitt came to the diner the way a man comes to a place he intends to own, slow and easy, a tall, narrow figure in a charcoal overcoat without a wrinkle in it, his hair combed back, his smile arriving a half-second before any reason for it. He was perhaps 50, smooth-shaven, with soft, pale hands that had never done a day of cold work. He saw Daniel at the counter and read him correctly, as the only stranger in town, and he came over and extended one of those soft hands. You must be the new man on Sumac Lane, Pruitt said. His voice was warm and even, every sentence finished and polished. Garrett Pruitt, I represent Meridian. We are doing some lovely things to restore the heritage sites in this area. You should be proud to be part of a community that values its history. Birch stood up from beside Daniel's stool. He did not growl. He simply rose and placed himself between the 2 men, his ears flat, his weight settled forward, and he stared at Pruitt with a steadiness that made the salesman's smile flicker for just an instant before he recovered it. Handsome animal, Pruitt said. He is a good judge of people, Daniel said. The smile held, but the eyes above it had gone cool. Pruitt let the moment pass, made his pleasantries, and left a glossy brochure on the counter before he went. Daniel looked at it after the man's car pulled away. Heritage preservation, it said, over a photograph of a chapel that was not Halvern's chapel, somewhere green and untroubled. He turned it over. In small print on the back was a list of properties acquired and the language of mineral and aggregate extraction rights. And Daniel understood that Cass had told him the whole truth. That night he sat at his uncle's kitchen table with Birch at his feet and laid the pieces out, the way he had once laid out a map before a patrol. A company buying dead land for the sand beneath it. A chapel and graveyard listed for sale on a tax lien. A closing date 6 weeks off. An old woman who walked that road, who would see and remember and speak, gently warned by everyone to stay home. And a coat given away in a storm to a freezing dog. 3 weeks before, that same woman was found freezing in the same place. He did not yet know how the coat fit, but he knew it fit somehow. And he knew that the legal way through this thing, the only way he would let himself take, ran through proof. A tax lien could be challenged if it was false. A sale could be stopped if the deed had never lawfully reverted. He needed records. He needed to know whether the parish that built the chapel had truly died, or whether someone had simply declared it dead and counted on no one alive to argue. He found his answer in Eleanor, once she was home and strong enough to dig through the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. Because Eleanor Pace, who had taught the town to read, had also for 40 years been the unofficial keeper of its paper. And in the bottom of that chest, wrapped in oilcloth, was the original deed to the chapel land and the charter of the congregation, and a folder of receipts showing that the small fellowship had gone on meeting and paying its modest dues right up until 8 years ago, when the last of the old members had grown too few to ring the bell. The parish had not been defunct for the 20 years Meridian's lien claimed. It had been alive and current far more recently. The lien was built on a lie about dates, and Eleanor had the papers that proved it. Frank kept everything, she said, her hands moving over the documents with a care that was almost tenderness. He used to say a man who throws away his receipts is asking to be robbed. She looked up at Daniel. I never understood why I kept this chest. I do now. Having the proof and using it were two different things, though. And Daniel knew the harder part was still ahead, because a closing date was a closing date, and a company like Meridian had lawyers and Eleanor had a cedar chest. And the gap between those two things was exactly the gap men like Pruitt counted on. He needed the records into the right hands, and he needed it done before March, and he needed witnesses, because paper alone could be misplaced or disputed, and he had learned long ago that a single voice is easy to silence. The week that followed was the one that changed him, though he would not have said so at the time. It began with Ruth, who heard what he was doing and arrived at Eleanor's door the next morning with a casserole and a list of names. It went on with Cass, who closed the diner an hour early and made calls. It grew when the man from the feed store, a stooped widower named Albert Voss, who had buried his own wife in that chapel yard, drove out in his ancient truck and pulled the surveyor's stakes out of the frozen ground one by one. Daniel had not asked him to, he had simply done it. And then he had stood in the cold beside the stacked stakes with his hat in his hands. Daniel found him there at dusk, the old man's breath smoking in the cold, his bare fingers raw from working the frozen ground. They put 1, not 3 feet from Clara's headstone, Albert said. He did not look at Daniel. He looked at the stones. 41 years I was married to that woman. I am not going to stand by while a man in a clean coat measures her grave for a sandpit. He worked his jaw. What do you need from me? Tell me and it is done. I need you to say that in a room full of people who can stop it, Daniel said. Not to me, to the county board. Albert turned the brim of his hat in his hands. He had not spoken in public, Daniel guessed, in a very long time, perhaps, not since the funeral. I am no good with words. You do not need words. You need the truth, and you have it. Daniel nodded at the stacked stakes. You already said the hardest part out loud just now. Daniel watched the town gather itself around the old woman, the way a body closes around a wound to protect it, and something in his chest that had been clenched for years began, against his will, to loosen. He had come north to settle a dead man's house and leave. He had told himself he wanted nothing from this place. But he found himself driving out to the chapel in the early dark to photograph the tracks and the stakes before more snow could cover them. He found himself sitting at Eleanor's table while she sorted papers, learning the names of people 3 generations gone. He found himself, one gray afternoon, repairing the chapel's broken back step, the one Frank Pace had built half a century before, because it seemed wrong to let it stay broken while they fought to save the building it belonged to. Birch lay in the snow and watched him work, and when Daniel finished and stood back, the dog rose and walked the length of the new board as if inspecting it, and then sat down on it, and Daniel found he had to look away for a moment. The mystery of the coat resolved itself in the second week, and it resolved in a way that tied the whole thing closed. It was Birch who found the dog. They were out at the culvert where Eleanor had first knelt in the storm, Daniel taking the last of his photographs, when the shepherd went rigid and then bolted across the field toward the tree line with his ears up. Daniel followed, and at the edge of the woods, in the lee of a fallen oak, was a makeshift shelter of branches and a scrap of brown wool, and curled inside it, thin but alive, was a young dog. It was perhaps 8 months old now, a rough-coated mix the color of dead grass, and it had survived the winter in the woods at the edge of Eleanor's road, living off what it could find, sleeping under the very coat she had wrapped it in 3 weeks before. It had not gone far at all. It had simply gone where it felt safe, and it had stayed. Birch did not threaten it. He approached slow, low, his tail level, and the young dog watched him with the wariness of an animal that had learned not to trust. And then Birch lay down in the snow a body's length away and waited. He waited a long time, and in the end the young dog crept out from under the wool and crossed the gap and lay down beside him, and the two of them rested there together while Daniel stood very still and did not breathe. He brought the young dog to Eleanor that evening, wrapped in a blanket, with the recovered coat folded over his arm. He would never forget her face when she saw it. She had not cried at any of it, not at the near death in the storm, not at the threat to her husband's grave, not through any of the long, hard days. But she cried then. She took the thin dog into her lap and pressed her face into its rough fur and wept without a sound. And she said over and over, so quiet he almost missed it, "You lived, you lived. I knew you lived." And Daniel, watching, understood at last what the coat had meant. It had never been about the wool. A woman alone, at the end of her life, who had buried a husband and a daughter and outlived nearly everyone she loved, had found one small shivering thing in the dark that needed her, and she had given it the only thing she had left to give. The walking out to the road, again and again, in the cold that could have killed her, had not been foolishness. It had been faith. She had needed to know that the thing she had saved had not been wasted. That goodness sent out into a storm came back to you somehow. It did. It came back as a town. The closing date stood at the 1st of March, and on the last day of February, the matter came before the county board, in the brick courthouse in the next town over, where Meridian had filed to confirm its lien and finalize the sale. Daniel had spent 2 weeks preparing for it, and he had done it the only way he would allow himself, with paper and witnesses and the patient assembling of truth. He had taken Eleanor's deed and charter and receipts to a legal aid attorney in the county seat, a tired young woman named Priya Sandoval, who handled more cases than any one person should, and who took one look at the documents and the dated receipts and went quiet for a long moment before she said, "They lied about when the parish closed. This whole lien is built on that lie. If we can show the congregation was current 8 years ago, the reversion never happened, and the sale is void. They could show it." Eleanor's receipts were dated, signed, and matched to bank records. Cass helped them pull. And on the last day of February, the small courthouse hearing room filled with people from Halvern, more than Daniel had expected, more than Pruitt had ever imagined could be gathered from a town he had taken for empty. Ruth came, and Cass, and Albert Voss, in a tie he had clearly not worn in 20 years, and a dozen others, sons and daughters and grandchildren of people buried in that ground. They did not shout, they did not threaten. They simply filled the room, and they sat, and when the board asked whether anyone wished to speak to the matter, they rose one at a time and told the truth about the chapel and the graves and the lie the lien was built upon. Pruitt sat at the front in his charcoal coat with his lawyer beside him, and Daniel watched the smooth confidence drain out of him by degrees as the documents were entered and the dates were read aloud, and Priya Sandoval laid the receipts before the board one after another. The reversion had never been lawful. The parish had been alive and current within the window. The lien claimed it dead. The whole sale rested on a forged timeline, and once the timeline broke, the sale broke with it. The board did not even need to deliberate long. They voided the lien, halted the sale, and ordered the property's status reviewed, and they did it while Pruitt sat there with his finished sentences gone dry in his mouth. He did not stay to face the town. Men like him never do. He gathered his papers and his lawyer, and he left by the side door before the room had finished emptying, and Daniel let him go, because the law had done what the law was for, and there was nothing to be gained from a confrontation in a parking lot. He had not raised a hand. He had not raised his voice. He had simply brought the truth into a room full of people and let it stand on its own legs, and it had been enough. It was almost always enough. He had come to believe if you were patient enough to build it. Right, Eleanor was not at the hearing. She was too frail for the cold drive, and she had asked Daniel to come tell her how it went, and so that evening he drove out to her small house at the edge of town with Birch in the seat beside him and the young dog, now named and fed and beginning to fill out, riding in the back. She had called the young one Storm, which Daniel thought was either the saddest or the rightest name he had ever heard, and could not decide which. He told her it was over. No. He told her the graves were safe. The chapel was safe. The sale was dead. And Eleanor sat in her chair by the window, with Storm asleep across her feet, and Birch lying watchful by the door. And she was quiet for a long time, looking out at the dark, and the snow coming down soft now, no wind in it. "Frank would have liked you," she said finally. "He did not trust easily, but he would have liked you." She turned her pale eyes on him. "You are leaving in the spring Howard's house. You said you would sell it. Go." Daniel did not answer right away. He looked at the old woman and the sleeping dog and his own shepherd by the door and out the window at the town, strung with its few lights along the frozen shore, and he found that the thing he had told himself for months, the thing about leaving, had quietly stopped being true at some point he could not name. "I thought I would," he said, "and now—" He was a long time answering. Birch lifted his head and watched him, and Daniel reached down and ran his hand along the dog's neck, and outside the snow kept falling soft over Halvern. Gentle now, the storm long past. I think I will fix the rest of that back step, he said. And the bell tower needs work before next winter. Eleanor smiled. It was a small smile, but it filled her whole tired face. That is not an answer, she said. No, Daniel agreed. I suppose it is not. And it was, they both knew it was. A man who plans to leave does not promise to mend a bell tower against the coming of a winter he intends to be gone before. He stays for that. He had been staying in pieces for weeks, and he had only now caught himself at it. He drove home that night under a clearing sky, the clouds breaking up to show a hard scatter of stars over the lake, and Birch rode beside him with his nose to the cold glass. Daniel thought about the long road he had walked to get to this small, frozen town, the deployments and the leaving, and the years of telling himself that places disappeared too easily, that the only safe thing was to never set your weight down anywhere it could be taken. He had believed that for a long time he had carried it like a pack. An old woman had given her coat to a shivering dog in a storm, though, and the dog had lived, and the giving had come back around to gather a whole town and save the ground where her husband slept. Goodness, sent out into the cold, did not vanish. It waited. It came back wearing a different shape, but it came back. He had watched it happen with his own eyes, and a man who has seen a thing like that cannot go on pretending he never did. Spring came late that year, the way it does up on the lake. The snow went gray and then went to mud. And then, one morning, in April, the first green showed in the chapel yard among the leaning stones. Daniel was out there with a level and a box of nails, rebuilding the bell tower stairs, when he heard a car on the road and looked up to see Eleanor's neighbor driving her out, slow over the soft ruts, to sit in the spring sun beside the grave she had nearly died to protect. She came down the path on a cane, with Storm trotting at her heel, healthy now, glossy, a wholly different animal than the skeleton he had carried out of the woods. Birch rose from where he had been lying in the new grass and went to meet them, and the two dogs touched noses and then walked together up the path the way old friends walk, and Eleanor lowered herself onto the bench by Frank's stone and lifted her face to the light. "You finished the step," she said, "and the railing." Daniel climbed down from the tower and stood wiping his hands on a rag. "Tower will be done by Sunday. Will you ring the bell?" He had not thought about it. The bell had not been rung in 8 years, since the last of the old congregation had grown too few. He looked up at it, the dull bronze of it under the new-mended wood, and then he looked at the old woman in the spring sun, with the two dogs at her feet and the graves green around her, and he climbed back up and freed the rope from where it had been tied off for nearly a decade. The sound rolled out over the chapel yard and the leaning stones, and the brush coming green again, out across the fields and down toward the lake and the small town strung along its shore, the first time in 8 years that bell had spoken. Eleanor closed her eyes and listened to it, with her face turned up and wet, and Storm pressed against her shins, and Bert sat at the foot of the tower and looked up the rope toward the sound, with his ears full forward, and Daniel stood there, with the rope warm in his hands, and felt the thing in his chest that had been clenched for so many years. Bally let go. He stayed. He did not say it out loud then or ever, but everyone in Halvern came to know it, the way a town knows its own. The Cormac boy was staying. He fixed the chapel, and then he fixed Eleanor's porch, and then he fixed half the roofs on the western shore, and Birch became a fixture beside him on every job. And Storm grew into a big, rangy, good-natured dog who slept on Eleanor's bed and walked her out to the chapel every week, so she never had to go alone again. The road that had nearly killed her became a path she walked, in company in good weather, with a healthy dog at her side and a town behind her. And here is the thing I want to leave with you, in the quiet after the bell. We spend so much of our lives guarding what little we have, afraid that if we give it away, give the coat off our own backs, give our trust, give our weight to a place that might be taken, we will be left with nothing. But the old woman in this story knew something the rest of us forget. The things we give away in the cold are the only things that come back to us, warm. She gave her coat to a shivering dog and nearly died for it. And what she got back was not the coat. It was a town that remembered her, a Marine who stayed, a grave kept safe, a bell rung again after 8 silent years. None of it would have come if she had kept her coat and walked on by. So, if there is something in your life you have been guarding too closely, some kindness you have been holding back because the world seems too cold to risk it, I hope this story stays with you a while. Give it anyway. Give the coat. You may not see what it becomes. The old woman did not. For 3 long weeks she did not. And she walked out into the storm again and again on nothing but the hope of it. But it becomes something. It always does. That is the quiet law underneath everything, the one the dogs seem to know before we do. May God keep you warm in the cold seasons and bring you a town that remembers you, and let every kindness you have ever sent out into a storm find its long way home. Thank you for staying to the end of this one. Take care of each other.